Yeah, let's get right into it. So, first of all, let's take a look at how colleges are right now in terms of the competitive landscape. One thing that came out just last month, actually, even just a couple of weeks ago, are the new US news rankings. I just want to really quickly give you a tour of what these are looking like, which colleges are now ranked higher. And it's a little bit anticlimactic, but there's probably not really that many changes. As you can see here, it's really much the same colleges that are at the top over here. In fact, there's not any significant changes. I think I want to just point out the most significant change that we see here, and that is University of Chicago jumped up a few spaces, right? So it's now number 6, and Caltech sort of swapped places with it, right? Other than that, the order is more or less very similar to last year. So not too much going on that front. For liberal arts colleges, much the same. We just had Swarthmore and the U.S. Naval Academy simply swapping places. So it's really a lot of the same names that dominate the list, right? So it's the same top schools. The Ivies tend to predominate in terms of the top 15 rankings in U.S. News. For a lot of the liberal arts colleges, it's still the same top names. One interesting change, though, from the public university perspective, is that UCLA dipped down a little bit and Berkeley reclaimed its spot as the top UC. This is definitely certainly an interesting kind of change here because UCLA does have a lower acceptance rate, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But in many ways, Berkeley is still viewed as like the top UC. It's usually got more competitive programs for popular fields like business and engineering. Okay. A lot of the same names also dominate. One thing you will notice here, and we'll talk about the UC system a little bit, is even looking at this list of top public universities, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the 9 UCs are represented here in the top public universities. So if you live in California, that's awesome because you get to benefit from having a lower tuition for a comparatively much more solid education system. It does also open doors if you are from outside of California and you're entertaining the option of going to school here in California. The UCs do still represent a pretty solid value in terms of higher education. Okay, so yeah, so let's get on that topic. Let's take a look at the UC application. One really interesting change this year, and it's something I kind of predicted the last couple of years or so, is that instead of a steady decline in terms of the acceptance rate, we've actually seen a bit of a turnaround this year. So as you can see here for UCLA and Berkeley, instead of dipping down even closer to like 8% or lower than 8%, UCLA bumped up just a little bit, like half a percentage point. Not huge enough to cause like any sort of major ripples. One change, though, that I noticed here is that for you out-of-state students, if you're not in California, there is a noticeable jump here from 9% to about 11%. So it seems like UCLA this past year in 2025 or for fall 2025's incoming class actually decided to accept more out-of-state students. We see a very similar thing with Berkeley as well, actually, right? So from 7% for out of state to about 10%. And here's the really interesting for Berkeley. Their international application rate went from about 3.3% up to about 6%. Okay. And this is not really by accident. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on here with this trend. We can see the trend holding up, though, for much of the other UCs as well. The one notable exception here is UC Irvine, which kind of more or less stayed the same, right? Its numbers stayed the same from last year's. But across the board, you can see some of the other UCs jump a little bit, right? Not by a significant amount. Well, maybe with the exception of Santa Barbara. That's a pretty big jump, to be honest, right? So you're looking at about a 5% jump in terms of its total acceptance rate. That's a pretty noticeable jump there. Most other campuses stay the same. The big difference was that last year, or the previous year, Merced and Santa Cruz or sorry, Riverside and Santa Cruz had lower acceptance rates, and that sort of jumped back to where they normally were. It was more like a one-time drop, I guess, right? So Merced still, the baby of the UC system is still accepting most California applicants. It's basically like the backup one for their what do you call this? Their in-state guarantee. So that's why a lot of the spots are taken up because a lot of the California students who didn't otherwise get into the other campuses, that would be the guaranteed slot to get in. Okay. All right. Yeah, so pretty much why is this going on? Right. So because this is definitely a reversal from the trend of a lot of other top schools where the acceptance rates tend to just typically inch downward, right? So there is a deliberate reason for this, right? And you could see the trend is over the last few years, actually, is that the total number of people being admitted into the UCs as a system as a whole has actually gone up and up. And that has largely because is largely because of pressure from the California legislature, from the governor, right, who's putting pressure on the UC campuses to certainly accept more California residents, right, and in exchange for increased state funding. So it's a little bit of a deal that the UCs are doing here. And of course, like I guess California students are the main beneficiary of this, right? Because the acceptance rates are going to be a little bit better in the foreseeable future because the UCs are making a concerted effort to increase the number of spots they have available, right? But it's not just for California students. As you can see here, even the number of out-of-state and international student accepted students are going up. And it does make sense, right? Because if a California legislature is going to increase the budgets for the UCs, accepting more out-of-state students and international students allows them to charge a little bit more tuition. So it's maybe subsidizing the cost of those budget increases at that point. Okay. All right. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and talk about the main topic for tonight, which are the soft factors in admissions. So what, pray tell, is a soft factor? Well, long story short, a soft factor compared to hard factors, the hard factors are the more quantitative and number heavy aspects of the college application, right? So this is factors like the GPA, your number of weighted courses, and things like your SAT or ACT scores or your AP scores, right? So these are often deemed as more objective factors because it's just a straight up number, right? So colleges do want certain metrics because they need to report averages of what are the average SAT scores for them and what the average GPAs are. So of course, those are pretty high standards. So oftentimes at admissions, if you're going for a lot of the top schools, these factors, the hard factors, can get you into the conversation if your scores are not significantly below what these schools are looking for, but they're by no means a guarantee because a good percentage or the majority of the applicants really are going to have fairly competitive numbers if you're looking at schools in the top 15 or top 20, right? So oftentimes, this is why I titled this the crucial tiebreakers because if you have an applicant pool of maybe like something like 60 or 70% of your applicant pool have straight A's or very close to straight A's, then how do you break that tie? What do you look at to compare one straight A student compared to another straight A student? Well, this is where the soft factors come in. So many top colleges use what's called holistic admissions to look at all the different factors, not as like one part is more important necessarily, but they take a look at it as a whole, right? And they try to tell a story of what the student was able to accomplish and then decide whether or not that student has certain qualities and certain accomplishments that would make them a suitable candidate for their school, right? So in total, the soft factors will include things like subjective, qualitative aspects like the essays, recommendation letters, interviews, along with the applicant's activity profile. And those are the four main things that I'll be discussing today, giving you tips in terms of how to strengthen those aspects, how to highlight them in the application process to really try to maximize the impact of how these aspects can help you round out your profile and how to portray yourself as a more competitive candidate for these schools. Okay. So oftentimes with these soft factors, admissions officers have a greater latitude, right? Because it's not a straight up number comparison like, oh, a 1400 versus a 1500. Okay. So they'll often use this discretion when evaluating candidates to be able to see, okay, well, what do we need in the incoming class? Because you're not going to have like, you're not going to accept 2,000 computer scientists, right? Or you're not going to accept, 2,000 people who are good at sports or people who are going to be doctors and have done a lot of like sciencey pre-med research, right? So they want a little bit of balance, right? So a lot of what they look at in the soft factors here is how do these students add to the incoming class and how do they help round out and allow students to learn from each other and benefit from each other's presence. Okay. All right. So this is based on the NACX survey, right? So this one's a bit dated. I should have used a more recent one, I guess. But I mean, it really hasn't changed too much, to be honest. So NACAC is the governing body of all admissions officers and high school guidance counselors. And they oftentimes do a survey of which factors are most important. So at the top here, you see the first four. These are the hard factors that I mentioned earlier. But you can also see here the other ones that I've decided to box here in purple. These are what are widely viewed as the soft factors. These are the different categories that students can be evaluated on, where it's not just a straight up set number. There's a little bit more discretion here in terms of how to evaluate, what they're looking for an essay, or what they are specifically trying to get out of the recommendation letters, or which activities they deem to be, potentially most impressive for their situation. Okay. All right, so let's dive into it. The first category I'll be going over tonight are extracurricular activities. This is obviously a big one, right? Because oftentimes what you've done beyond your classes and your test scores will often shape, what they're looking for. In some cases, students can be quite extraordinary for certain activities that they've done, so that colleges will definitely pay attention, especially if students are so exceptional that they can even be like nationally competitive or even internationally competitive for an activity. So let's take a look. So what are they looking for? Well, okay, so one of the key myths that I typically like to debunk is this idea that colleges, especially like Ivy League level schools or Ivy plus schools, want really well-rounded individuals. Okay. That's not exactly very logical, because if you had 2,000 incoming freshmen to a class and they're all equally well-rounded, but no one's really excellent in certain fields, then that's not necessarily going to be a very dynamic and interesting class. It's not a class that can benefit from each other. It's not, it's going to limit like which students can do, which activity students can do at a very high level. Okay. So because of this, you don't want to think of it in terms of colleges wanting well-rounded students. They want a well-rounded freshman class, right? So in fact, it's better if you can actually bring in certain things, certain activities, certain skill sets that you can do at a very high level, because that's really what's going to grab the attention of many admissions officers, right? So long story short here, if you're looking, if let's say, for example, you're a younger student, you're still in seventh, eighth, ninth grade, one of the key things I typically recommend to students is don't be too much of a generalist. Try to really find what your strengths are, right? So which activities you can do at a very high level. Okay. So to take a closer look at this, we can take a look at this interview form from a certain college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's all I'll say about this. So this is how they evaluate your extracurriculars, right? So it's not necessarily how many activities you have, it's really what you can do in terms of how high of a level of accomplishment you've managed to do in that particular activity, right? So as you can see here, the most impressive students who would earn a 1 are largely students who they say here have national or international recognition or professional potential, okay? Truly unusual achievement. Some students will have more of like a school-wide, regional, or statewide recognition, which is still not bad. In fact, probably a greater percentage of applicants to these top schools, like these Ivy level schools, will probably be like a 2. Oftentimes they'll rate them as like a 2 plus, 2 minus, and there'll be a little bit of a range there as well. Okay. Oftentimes, if they got a 3 or a 4, generally it's probably not strong enough to be really competitive, right? Compared to other students applying to these really high caliber schools. Okay. So what can we take away from this? Well, first of all, our recommendations are, especially if you're a younger student, try to discover early on what your passions and where your passions and talents lie, ideally even before high school. So if, let's say, for example, you're really truly exceptional at music or martial arts or speech and debate, it makes sense for you to try to see if you can really develop that talent to the highest ability you can, because then you have more of a chance to really be on the radar of these top colleges if you can find that one activity that you could do at a really high level. Okay. Now, this is not to say that you want to be truly just one dimensional. Of course, it's not a bad idea to show colleges that you have other interests as well. So oftentimes, in terms of the activity profile, we often tell students to have like one main or two main activities, at least one activity that's really related to your major to show passion for that field, and then maybe one or two complementary activities to show that you have other interest as well. But if you spread yourself thin to like 3, 4, or 5 activities, and you're spending, just like a lot of time for multiple ones, that'll oftentimes potentially stunt your progress or growth. It might cap or limit your potential in one activity where you could truly shine and really get the attention of these top schools. Okay. So the key advice here that I can give you is don't sacrifice your potential in any activity that you're truly excellent at just because you feel like, oh, someone told me I need a sport. Someone told me I need to be able to do this or that. Honestly, there's no checklist of activities that colleges need, right? Right, find out what you're good at. Find out what you're truly passionate about that you can do at the highest level you can. Okay. All right. One other key thing, though, that colleges tend to look for these days, volunteering is one of those things where you can't go wrong putting in more time and energy doing some volunteer hours, just because a lot of colleges do tend to care about this more in recent years. I would say the last 10 years or so, it's become a bigger priority for many colleges to see that students are, in fact, very dedicated towards at least a couple of what do you call this, major commitments or causes that they're very dedicated towards. And the story behind this is pretty simple, right? The vast majority of colleges are not actually for profit, they're nonprofit, despite what you might think based on how much money they charge for tuition. Okay. Um, and the key here is that because they are very mission oriented, they have a vision for what they want their graduates to do. Being able to show at a young age that you are already a difference maker, even as a young high schooler, can definitely make you stand out and definitely make them feel that you are a good philosophical fit for what they're trying to look for. People who can make an impact, people who will be difference makers when they graduate. So one of the key bits of advice I want to give you is don't worry too much about like hours or racking up total number of hours. That's not actually as important as showing that you've truly made an impact in what you do for volunteering. Okay, so a lot of students were kind of panicking a little bit a few months ago when the presidential award got defunded, right? But I tell students don't really worry about that because that's not honestly what colleges focus on too much. They're much more interested in going to look at the exact things that you do for volunteering. So instead of like PVSA Gold, for example, I think colleges would actually be much more impressed by a stellar recommendation letter from a place where you do volunteering and they talk about how you genuinely do heartfelt work over there, that you were contributing member to what they were trying to do in terms of service, and that you really help try to build a community or try to solve problems in your community. I think that's actually much more impactful than, let's say, for example, some accolade that simply just reinforces the number of hours that you already have. I mean, don't get me wrong, things like the presidential award or the congressional award are certainly not bad to have, but that should not be the end all be all of why you do community service. Okay. So it's more important that you make genuine, meaningful connections with the people there and that you really try to show the impact that you made when you do volunteering. I think that's, and at the end of the day, that's much more important for college admissions people. Okay. So the next category we're going to be taking a look at tonight are recommendation letters. So let's talk about that. First of all, how important are recommendation letters? Well, not too bad, right? So below the essay, which we'll talk about last, I guess I just want to put a little bit more emphasis on that here. Um, Counselor recommendation letters, yes, you do need one from your counselor as well. And a couple of teacher recommendations are actually kind of important as part of the process because they're another way that admissions people can sort of like flesh out what kind of a person you are. Yes, you can talk about yourself in the essay, but oftentimes it's helpful to be able to get the vantage point of certain adults that you've interacted with because they also have a longer sort of institutional knowledge. They can compare you against other students, and they'll be able to tell colleges whether or not you would be like a strong fit for them. They'd be able to kind of like compare you to other students they might have recommended in the past. And in general as well, also like be able to rate you. So that's one of the things I'll show you later is like teachers, especially, they have a rubric of like certain categories by which they rate their applicants. So what's the process here? So how do top colleges evaluate recommendation letters? So first of all, recommendation letters help to provide insight on applicants about various qualities that their teachers and school counselors see in them, right? So these rec letters are evaluated holistically, right? So you don't have to panic if, let's say, for example, you realized, oh, this one teacher was kind of like lazy about the application, or maybe wasn't necessarily writing a strong recommendation letter as you would have hoped. Um, of course, you do want all of them to be pretty strong, ideally, right? But one bad rec letter is not going to mess up everything, right? So a bad rec letter isn't enough to basically be the reason why you got denied. Okay. Now, of course, conversely, a strong recommendation letter can help your case, but also that by the same token, it's not enough to get you in just because you had like one good recommendation letter. Think of just part of a whole, right? It's one of the many ingredients, in the dish that, help you stand out in order to be accepted to a top college. Okay. So, of course, the best recommendation letters are those that often frame the student's accomplishments relative to other students, right? So I often tell students if you could ask the teacher to compare you to other students that might have gotten into certain schools that you're hoping for, those would help them help the admissions officers at least be able to see how the teacher sees you compared to other students that they might have sent to top schools in the past. Okay. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that they would do these comparisons, but if you trust the teacher knows you pretty well, this is certainly something that is expected, of like students who are applying to top schools. Okay. All right. So usually as part of the college application process, a teacher and a counselor will often have their own Common App account as well, much like the seniors do who are applying, right? So the teacher or the counselor will log in. They'll be asked certain questions about your relationship or their relationship with the student. How long have they known you? And then after that, there's often going to be a chart much like this in which teachers and counselors are supposed to rate students relative to their current class, right? So compared to other students in that class, that applicant class, they're supposed to rate you. So of course, the highest praise they can heap on you is if they check this box here in this category of one of the top few I've encountered, top 1%. So it's not even just compared to your class. That's basically saying you're so good that you're one of the best they've ever encountered in their career, right? So ideally, that's the level of praise that you would want from your teachers that would be rating you. Now, of course, it's all relative. You know what I mean? Like some teachers tend to be a little bit stingier on the ratings. So they will also, an admissions office will typically also see maybe if there's certain traits that a teacher rates higher than the others, because then that might draw their attention to certain traits that the teacher feels that the student brings to the table, right? Um, so yeah, this is just a little glimpse of what they typically do in the evaluation process. All right, so how many recommendation letters would you need? Well, typically you will get one from your school counselor. That's sort of by default. You don't need to ask them. They will already do it as part of your college application. So for your school teachers, though, it's typically two. Two is like this nice, safe magic number. Some schools may only allow you one, in which case you just go with whichever one of the two is your stronger one. Some schools may allow you an optional one in addition to that too. So you might have up to three, in some cases, even four teachers. But I just want to let you know that more isn't necessarily better though, right? So if let's say, for example, you have two exceptional teacher recommendations and you have a couple that are like, okay, not too great, but they kind of still like you, then that might kind of dilute the overall quality, right? So if you have two exceptionally strong ones, it may even be better to just rest on the laurels of what those two teachers are saying, rather than simply trying to add more just for the sake of adding more teachers. Now, of course, if you have a third one that is just dying to write you a stellar recommendation letter, absolutely, right? You should certainly consider that. Now, many schools, not all schools though, but many schools may allow you to submit anywhere from one to three outside recommendations. These are in the Common App labeled as other recommenders. So these could be coaches, art, music, or dance teachers, internship supervisors. It could be like a pastor from church or anything like that. Just people, usually adults that know you or have gotten to know you pretty well and can attest to your other qualities. It's oftentimes a good idea to have these, especially if they can shed light on other strengths that you have, maybe from an extracurricular or maybe from a different vantage point from a traditional teacher, because they want to talk about certain qualities like you're exceptionally kind and caring, especially if you're going to get a rec letter from, let's say, someone from a volunteering opportunity that you have, right? All right. So ultimately, when you're picking who to write the recommendation letters, it's important for you to not necessarily focus on impressive titles. I would suggest look for people who got to know you pretty well. So let's say, for example, you volunteer, or let's say you have an internship at a company or at a lab somewhere. Sure, you can get like the big fancy title, the dean or the director, or like the CEO of the company. But if they barely got to know you, then they're not going to be able to write a really strong recommendation letter for you because a lot of the questions are geared towards like, like providing information that necessitates like more exposure, like more of a knowledge of the student's strengths. Okay. So it's not really about like the big name or the fancy title or the big company. It's more about whether or not they got to know your individual strengths and can write examples or anecdotes to demonstrate that in the recommendation process. Okay. So ultimately, it's probably best for you to select, especially if you're talking about these outside other recommenders, to pick people who've gotten to know you pretty well. Now, of course, if you can get the best of both worlds and have someone who is a pretty impressive sounding person who got to know you pretty well, then that's really kind of like the best. That's the ideal that you want to strive for if you can find it. Okay. But if you had to compare fancy title versus someone who knows you really, really well, err on the side of someone who got to know you pretty well for picking these recommendation letters. Okay. Next, some other recommendations I'd like to make here. So as far as teacher recommendations, the ideal grade level it would be your 11th grade teachers for the simple reason that they're going to be your most recent full year. And for many high schools, your 11th grade coursework tends to be your hardest coursework, right? This is where we have like some of the most challenging AP courses like AP US history or AP physics or, AP chemistry, right? So it makes sense that some of these teachers who typically are pretty hard themselves or hard graders, if you can impress them and actually get a good grade in their class and be able to really shine relative to your peers, those would be the teachers that you want. Okay. Now, sometimes I hear students say, like, oh, I really want to get a rec letter from this teacher because so and so writes good rec letters for everyone. Okay, that's good, I guess, to some extent, but then that may not necessarily be the best scenario, right? Because if that teacher writes good rec letters for everybody, how are you supposed to stand out, right? So it's probably best if you find a teacher who knows and likes you pretty well, but doesn't always write good rec letters for everybody equally, right? So if they're willing to say a little bit extra about you or be able to compare you and put you at a higher pedestal than everybody else, that's really kind of ideally the best case scenario when you're trying to get a recommendation letter. Okay. So for younger students, this is not something that happens overnight. This takes work, right? So even before junior year, though, you should definitely try to be, on your best behavior. Try to show that you actually care about the content of the class by asking smart questions. Typically, I tell students if you can be ahead, be in preview mode, is what I call it, of what topics you covered in class, you're far more able to and likely to provide smart feedback and commentary in class discussions, ask smart questions because you're not being reactive. You're not just passively waiting to find out what the teacher's saying. You have a sense in terms of where the teacher is going to go in terms of the topics, and you can then interject more useful information into the class or ask smarter questions, like I said. Okay. So ultimately, be courteous and respectful. Even ninth grade and 10th grade, it's not like you just turn on the switch by 11th grade because oftentimes teachers talk to each other. There is that faculty room where sometimes teachers will gossip and talk about students in their classes. And sometimes your reputation will precede you, right? So if you have a teacher that really dislikes you because you're annoying and talk too much in class, that's not relevant to the classroom discussions, that reputation can precede you by the time you get to your 11th grade teachers. So it's really important to think about this as a long-term process of impressing the faculty at your school as a whole.